super grateful here. Want to give a massive shout out to Marissa and the events team at Flowcarbon for putting this on. Everybody, big round of applause. Thank you so much. This has been such a great day. I love ReFi. I love having an online community, but there's just nothing better than being with a bunch of regens, hanging out, eating food, and telling good stories. So very grateful to be joined here by Alan Ransel, Gregory Landua, and Danny, whose last name I forgot, but Danny Osorio, good thing your name was up there. And yeah, we're gonna be diving into building and funding public goods in the relationship of climate finance. So quite an interesting territory, as many of these businesses in the space are actually for profit. But there's this really core element of taking care of the commons and investing in infrastructure that everybody can use. So I know we would have our resident expert, Kevin Iwaki, on the public goods stage. He's not here today, so we'll kind of hold this open seat for either he or Brianna. But I'll start it off really with you, Alan, around like just a simple definition of what is a public good.
Yeah, so public goods are goods that are non-excludable, so you can't prevent someone else from accessing them, and they're non-rivalrous, so you can't own them by yourself, right? They're owned by a commons. And I think the crucial thing to know about public goods is for a long time it was assumed that if you have a commons, that commons is going to be subject to the tragedy of the commons, right? People are going to exploit that good and degrade it. Elinor Ostrom was a Nobel Prize winning economist who did a lot of work showing that, firstly, it is possible to maintain public goods for a long period of time. And her Nobel Prize winning work looked into what conditions do you need to actually make that possible. And she found 8 conditions that essentially amount to community governance principles, which are really central to a bunch of the ReFi projects that we all work on and how we're setting up the system, especially Regen Network. So if you want to talk, I don't know, you said we could tee up other people.
Yeah, well, Gregory, curious to get your take on public goods just in general.
In three points. Number 1, public goods are bad. Number 2, all commons should be enclosed and liquidated. And number 3, we should optimize for private efficient markets to take care of all of our problems. Back to you, John.
I hear centralization is the most efficient.
And centralization is the most efficient. Do you have anything to add?
I heard Regen was going in this new direction a few minutes ago.
So for those who don't know, we decided to pivot about 5 minutes ago and just liquidate all of the, frou-frou. And
I was a little concerned about it, but then I just imagined the liquidity that's going to be unlocked by this new direction.
Right.
And I was
massive liquidity through the enclosure of commons.
Perfect.
This is why we should do it, because that's the...
This is Gregory's hot take of the day, everybody. Let's give him a quick round of applause and move on to the real conversation.
All right. Yeah, thank you. I was put up to this by some nefarious people last night. And also, to pull the curtain back, we thought it would be kind of interesting to do a little bit of a fun thing here so that it wasn't just the normal panel saying the things that we always say and, just like mix it up a little bit. So what I really believe is that, number 1, to do it in 3 parts. Number 1, everything that we're talking about here related to assets that can reverse climate change or regenerate ecosystems or create more efficient grids, these are all public goods. These are non-excludable. We can't exclude access to clean air. If the air is cleaner, everyone benefits from that. We can't, and oddly enough, in order to power these markets, we also need transparency around the science that underpins understanding, did the air get cleaner or dirtier, or is the soil healthier or less healthy? And so this whole space, regenerative finance space, by its nature is generating public goods. And eco-credits, carbon credits particularly, are an example actually of an attempt to bring markets to public goods. And this is what makes the space so fascinating and so interesting and so challenging.
Totally.
So actually, this year at ETHDenver, we decided to dedicate an entire village and stage to impact and public goods. It's called Regionlandia. And it's the first stage that you hit when you enter, so everyone has to go through Regionlandia. And So it was interesting trying to define what really fell into that and like what kind of content we would put in that stage because, the obvious side is like, oh, the ReFi movement and anything related to impact projects. And, we sort of stretched it into like the solar punk side. But we also thought a lot about, you talked about goods like clean air that you can't exclude people from, but we actually decided to include things that you could exclude people from that we think are really like pretty foundational human rights and societal elements that should fall under that category. And we made kind of two big decisions, which is we put all of the privacy, so ZK related content, and the identity related content in there too, because we felt that like your identity shouldn't belong to corporations. It shouldn't be something that like others own or others control. It should be something that like is very much in the space of public goods. That is not the case today, but it should be. And then we put all of the privacy related topics and content in there, except for some really, really, really intense like deep dives where we're like, all right, that's going to Deftopia. But the general talks around that really went there because we think something like privacy is a universal foundational human right, and it should fall into the category of public goods.
And as a VC, how do you invest according to this thesis, right? Like if public goods are coming out of this space, isn't that kind of diluting your returns in some capacity? Like how do you balance a VC needing to deliver returns to LPs, but also wanting to create good for the widest number of people?
I think that's a really, really difficult challenge. I mean, I started my career working at an SRI fund. So the idea of a socially responsible investment is very, very broken today because what I realized when I thought that I was going to be shifting the flow of capital into socially responsible enterprises was not actually what was happening. It was more like you were rubber stamping and de-risking billion-dollar corporations, just saying like, yeah, this looks like no one's figured out something's wrong there. Like, let's go ahead and do this. And like, you were clearly instructed not to do any real research other than reviewing documents that were publicly available. And so I sort of came into this with disillusionment of how the space had really tackled this. And I think that like there is sort of this misconception that exists that you like can't make returns if you like care about things like the environment or the people that are impacted by this. And I think that is like a fallacy. And so I think when we think about making investments, not all of them necessarily touch the side of impact, but when they do, we really try to think of projects that are sustainable, that are going to get community alignment, that have collective economics in play, and really think about like how those models can also like produce returns and be sustainable.
Can I key off of one of the things you're talking about? So this I think really important point that there are all sorts of goods that we need to protect that don't follow under that narrow definition, right, of public goods necessarily, but things like identity that a company shouldn't own. I think one of the really powerful things about the technologies that we're working on is that we're able to flatten information hierarchies by using verifiable data, right? Is that frequently, we're trying to solve these problems that are global, right, or at least regional, that have tons of different stakeholders in them who can all contribute something. And the methodologies that people have developed in order to allow people to contribute, to like prove that they are, using regenerative agriculture principles, or prove that they're protecting forest, or any other sort of goods that people are contributing to. In Web2, right, everyone validates that data by some sort of centralized method, right? And it ends up right in this database that's controlled by a single entity. And I think like a big part of the sort of realization in the space is that if we build verifiability into the data itself, right, at the data level, we're able to take a lot of those information hierarchies, right, and flatten them in a way that allows many more people to participate, right? And so there's this like deep connection between how do you empower people who are on the front lines of climate change or on the front lines of biodiversity to contribute to these systems in a meaningful way and be meaningful stakeholders. There's a parallel between that and these technologies that we're building to actually take that data and verify it without relying on these points of centralization.
So the flattening, I think, of the hierarchies is really interesting and really difficult because we've thought about this a lot. Like, for example, like who should own the internet, right? And so, okay, what if we put a token on the internet and we all distribute it so we all own a piece of the internet? What happens over time? It's like maybe like you sell me your piece of the internet and now I own more of the internet, right? And then I start to like accumulate and then suddenly like time goes by and like generations go by, and now there's a group of people that own the internet and everyone else doesn't, right? And that's sort of like this dystopian future of like, if you apply direct tokenization to public goods models and an idea of decentralization, the decentralization might be temporary and actually not complete. So we started thinking about concepts of like, what about like leases? Like you could sort of partially lease, but the lease belongs to a collective that like defines a group, and then the group itself gets integrated. So because like it's essentially, how do you replace governments and stewards, right? Right now it's like the government owns your identity and it stewards your identity, but it's like, if we live in a world that's borderless, doesn't have that, how do we replace that? Because we can't just hand over like the keys to whoever volunteers.
And I think with all the energy in the space around building these new governance models, right, you're really able to build mechanisms that can either use loans, like you were saying, rather than direct ownership, or dilute ownership over time to people who are involved with the protocol or the network. Right, I would really plug, it's not exactly in the ReFi space, but this essay by Sam Altman called Moore's Law for Everything, which says effectively that we should take all companies above a certain size, have them pay 3% a year in taxes, and distribute that among all of the citizens, like of the country, every year, right? And so the effect of that is to spread ownership and interest among everyone, right? And the companies that are going faster than that, like, people keep plenty of money, right? These like really sort of radical ideas as to how we should deal with ownership, I think are coming to the fore, and it's a really good thing.
Yeah, it's super interesting, the idea of like this 3% tax for these massive companies that have had, a lion's share of the gains from the tools of our time. The internet, the massive waves of information of people putting their entire lives online, and these data aggregation models that basically sells desire back to us through what they know about us. And it's very effective. It's a very effective business model, Google and Facebook and the like. And I think it's interesting to see this Paris climate agreement, this massive global consensus of the nations of the world finally agreeing on something to hit net zero by 2050 and to reduce global emissions by 50% before 2030. These are hundreds of trillions of dollars that are now moving into a space to try and figure out, how do we actually value this stuff that hasn't been accounted for? And I think what you're doing, Gregory, at Region Network is especially interesting as you're looking to lay the foundations for originating these assets and the systems of account to really care for the commons that everybody needs to survive. And we're now seeing, when this stuff falls apart, this is actually what happens. So can you walk us through a little bit of kind of your philosophy and your approach around making this opportunity available as the market grows?
Yeah, so number one, I think, and this has kind of been maybe implicit in the conversation preceding, is that if we're going to create markets for public goods, the appropriate infrastructure for that is public networks. Why? Because the very value that we're talking about requires community participation. It's embedded in commons processes. It's embedded in public processes. So you really need to build an underlying infrastructure that is governed by the appropriate stakeholders in the process. So what we've done at Region Network is really try to anchor Region Network itself as a network that is governed and owned by a set of stakeholders such as land stewards and indigenous people and scientists and activist groups. Why? Because the foundations for markets of these sorts are the authenticity and legitimacy of the claims, of the credit itself. And if you can't generate that, if you have a marketplace that's sort of private and owned and operated by private actors, number one, the first thing that happens is the general populace won't trust it. The second thing that happens is you'll have erosive market behavior that starts to slowly undermine things. And so one of the things that I think we all recently just witnessed is the carbon credits that were produced by Vera over about a decade, according to the REDD+ protocol, have been getting called out by investigative journalists for overissuance. So there's different ways to look at that, but the way that I tend to look at it is that Vera, I think probably through no fault of their own, because this is difficult, hasn't necessarily included all of the stakeholders that really need to be present at maintaining and upgrading the standards and the processes. Are there indigenous people? Are there activist groups? Is Greenpeace being consulted? No, there's these fringes, right? There's these people, but they're actually the ones who need to be included to hold the market accountable for the public goods, because you can't, unlike that, the last thing I'll say is there's a significant difference in how we think about a carbon credit because it's a public good than how we think of a bushel of wheat. Bushel of wheat is something that my private ownership and my deal with the baker can allow me and my family to eat the bread, right? But the carbon credit, is a public benefit, like if the forest is saved, everyone is benefiting from that. And so therefore it requires a community process to actually instantiate the value. For the value to be understood, it requires a whole community to participate in it.
And I think just one thing to double down there is that, yes, Vera and these other actors are nonprofits, but you look at the business model, they're incentivized to issue credits. And I think looking at public goods in the context of this whole space, open source software, there's also a cultural precedent here to making sure that we're building the next level of infrastructure and innovation that actually is robust enough to take the value flows. And I'd love to turn the conversation to you, Alan. I know there are some people who know more about Filecoin and IPFS than others, but I think what you guys are doing in particular around decentralized file storage is pretty fantastic, because last time I heard, we're 11% of the size of AWS. Where are you guys at now? Give us a snapshot of the scale of what you're doing and how you're approaching making sure that this infrastructure is growing in a way that's planet positive and publicly verifiable.
Yeah, so exactly. So Filecoin is a decentralized storage network. So it's like Airbnb for file storage. So you can pay people to store data for you and verify that they're actually storing this data on the network. And Filecoin Green does a bunch of things. One of the things we do is connect that network verifiably to renewable energy. And the other thing is we look at where can we use public data, verifiable data, and decentralized data in order to underpin these sorts of systems, right? And so CO2.storage is one example of that. So if you go to CO2.storage, that is a URL, because URLs have all sorts of words in them these days. You can store data where the data itself is content addressed. So you can verify that if you look for a resource, no one's tampered with that resource. But the data format is also content addressed. So that data schema is non-tamperable. It's verifiable, right? And so what that allows us to do is solve all of these interoperability problems in Web3. So one example of these sorts of interoperability problems is that you may want to interface between Regen Network's data model and, say, Toucan's data model, right? If you have to build all of these transformations yourself, so if you have to go whenever you have a new data model and explicitly code how am I going to transform from this one to this one, that takes a long time, slows things down, slows development down. But if all of the data that we work with is explicitly typed, we're able to build transformations that themselves are public goods, right? So can we build this infrastructure and lock it open in a way that we have this corpus of not just data, but also data models and transformations between data models that allow us to build this larger infrastructure of public goods. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking, Gregory, is that part of the power of what Regen is doing is building this infrastructure that allows small communities to get compensated for their projects, right? And the way to scale these sorts of projects in a way that aligns with Eleanor Ostrom's principles for managing a public good is to aggregate more communities, right? Not necessarily to make the communities themselves bigger, because you lose the ability to govern a commons effectively when you get beyond too many people, right? And scale it up too fast that way. And if you think about it, that's really what we mean by flattening these information hierarchies, right? Building these tools using publicly verifiable data and transformations between those data so that anyone can work with them, anyone can verify them as a public good, and getting to a point where people who are on the front lines of climate change don't have to decide between making money and saving the natural world. They can actually make money and get paid to preserve forests and do that verifiably.
Just to build on that, I think one of the primary things that we need to focus on, the unifying public good for ReFi, that we're all, the infrastructure that we all need for this regenerative economy to be born really has to do with the lowering the marginal cost of an audit, which is what Alan just talked about. So if we create, so just like back in the day, it would have cost us lots of money to move goods across the United States before railroads existed. Imagine what you had to do to move a ton of goods from New York to San Francisco before there was a railroad. The same is true right now in carbon markets. Imagine how much effort you have to put in to verifying a claim that's backing a carbon credit. The Guardian, and this isn't a comment about the efficacy or accuracy of their critique, but the Guardian spent, several people spent like 6 to 8 months combing through Vera's claims and doing interviews and all of these things in order to generate a critique of that specific credit. So there's an analog here. And what we're talking, the foundation, the real public goods that we need to fund is this infrastructure piece whereby we can quickly and efficiently and effectively audit that claim about the eco-credit. Was the community compensated? Is the forest there? What's the level of biodiversity? And to do those things, to audit those things, you need this interoperability of data formats and schemas. You need to have registries of methodological approaches, and all of that has to be machine readable. Everything has to be auditable by the computer itself to make it that efficient. And that's the foundational transformation of infrastructure that is underpinning the regenerative finance economy that we're all building right now.
And can I say, if you're interested in playing with these tools or contributing to them, you can go right now to sbs.tech. There's a Sustainable Blockchain Summit coming up along with a hackathon that's going on right now. That hackathon is a good place to go if you're a developer and you want to build some of these methodologies, transformations, work with data underlying carbon offsets, or even if you're not a developer. So there are bounties up there for creating new methodologies for The Guardian. Hedera is one of our partners working on this. So that's if you want to dig into some of these methodologies underlying carbon offsets and just build data schemas for them, right? So you don't need to know how to program Solidity. You can just contribute in that way, right? Or if you want to find public data sets that are valuable, that have to do with sustainability, there are bounties for just finding data sets and making them accessible. So there are a ton of ways to contribute. Go to sbs.tech, and you can also learn about the Sustainable Blockchain Summit, which is happening in April, as well as the hackathon that's going on right now.
Super cool. I appreciate that, and I love that call to action, that this isn't just about listening, it's about doing stuff and celebrating the success of making that small, marginal, incremental improvement. Because climate change is a massive coordination problem, and we can't do everything. We just have to do our part and stay in tune and in time with the rest of the movement around us. So in that spirit, Danny, I'd love to turn it to you, because as a partner at a venture capital firm, you're obviously seeing loads and loads of deals. And it seems to me that over the last year, we've had a relatively seismic transition as Ethereum has gone successfully to proof of stake. Is there any specific trend or major opportunity that you're seeing surfacing, or just specific gap in the market that you're super excited about people filling in this stage?
Sure, absolutely. So I think the business models of the future that are going to be really successful within Web3 are going to lean heavily into the concept of collective economics and circular economies. And what I mean by that is that right now, the way the world has sort of shaped up is that you have corporations that collect your data, sell it on your behalf, and give you a little bit of entertainment. And that's how it sort of comes together, or some sort of connection. And that maybe that was the way that the technology had to pioneer, but it's definitely not the right way for it to continue over time, especially as people gain more agency and awareness and understanding all of this. So, I recently found out that I'm an avid Instagram shopper. I tend to click on a lot of things that get shown to me, and I buy things. And someone recently told me that every time I do this, some business gets $20 to $80, as a cut of what I've purchased. And I think those are the business models that are really ripe to be disrupted, because I don't actually mind being advertised to because I want to buy the thing. Like they're like sometimes they're hitting the things I do want, and like I am open to that. But I do think that my data should belong to me, and I think that like I should be benefiting from a piece of that, and then a part of that should also go to fund the rails of what I'm using. They should go to contribute to improving the mechanisms we're using to combat climate change. It should really be like something where like rather than these goods and services going to like fund the creation of new billionaires and large corporations, the businesses that are going to really succeed are going to be the ones that are simply like service providers. It's like the value capture goes to the communities, to the people, to the planet, and then the corporations are just, helping make that happen. They're facilitators. They take, a small percentage for facilitating that, and then it sort of moves on. Whereas right now, they take essentially the lion's share of everything, and you're
users are the product. Yeah,
exactly. So I think that's sort of the interesting inversion, and the companies that figure out how to do that in their own mechanism are going to be super successful.
I would also say we're closing out here, but I think this idea of public goods itself is recognizing, our shared humanity. The fact that we all need clean air, we all need vibrant, healthy soil. We need a stable climate, but we also need each other. And I think what the pandemic has taught all of us is that we are actually not fully human if we are not in relationship with one another. And so I think it really resonated to me as Dana was talking about Near Foundation, the partnership there, and this really movement to bring all these different technology providers together under a mission of stabilizing our climate and not just optimizing for carbon, but for a better society that is more just and inclusive, and really design it for the people that actually aren't here today because they couldn't afford to be here or they didn't have the passport to get on the plane. And to recognize that if we are to be successful, we have to support the 2 billion people around the world that don't even have access to banks. And so that would be my call to action to everyone here today, is to take the power of these incredibly strong coordination tools and use this not only for your own gain, but for the gain of those people who need it most. Because right now, climate change is being fought on the front lines by people who did absolutely nothing to cause it. And in all honesty, it sucks to say this, we are the ones who have caused it. This is our job.
And
that's what we're here today.
One last closing thing. Speaking of blockchains, the idea that like blockchains working on proof of work versus proof of stake, the energy consumption there is like absolutely monumentally different. It's like 99.9% more energy efficient when you have something like Near on proof of stake, like Ethereum on proof of stake, versus something like Bitcoin. And so I think that like as people who are builders, who are hodlers, who are investors, we also have to be conscious of like how the technology that we're supporting and using is working. And I hope that in the future, any blockchains that really survive are using proof of stake, and that we sort of like refuse to use things that are not considering the environment and their technology.
Awesome. We're out of time here, so we're gonna have to shoot.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say like 100%, and that a lot of the excuses that people have used to justify the extractive economy that we have are wearing really thin right now, right? Renewable energy is cheaper than fossil energy. We don't need these points of centralization because we can verify data at the data layer, right? So we're actually able to build, these excuses that have kept the current system in place are wearing thin now, and we can build something better.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Give these amazing panelists a round of applause, and we'll move on to the next section.